Hi, folks. We're ready to start week 4 of the visual history of photography. Just a little bookkeeping. This past week, obviously, had some glitches in the Zoom program, and it's been a tough ride. But in any case, the backup this week is going to be a recorded lecture. And then I'll send this all to you. And so thank you for bearing with me. I think I'll bring in a team of IT people next week, maybe 15 or 20 people that will be working feverishly to get this going so that we can all communicate for week 5. So this week I'm going to be talking about the period from 1915 to 1939. And I'm going to be, first of all, starting off with one of my hero photographers, my great aunt Marion McCune Rice. And she is a World War I Red Cross nurse. And a little background, we had the fortune to find a massive amount of her negatives and photographs. And I have them in my possession now. And we were able to make a documentary back in the late 90s, which has been very successful in documenting her history of a World War I nurse over in France. But one of the things she did besides nursing was taking photographs. And she put all of her pictures in about 3 or 4 albums. And under each picture, she specifically mentioned what the picture was about and who was in the picture. This is pretty rare. Turned out to be one of the better collections in the United States of documented nursing history and medical history in World War I by a nurse from America. She was featured in a national documentary by the History Channel, and she was also featured at the 125th anniversary of the American Red Cross in Washington, D.C. So in her right, she was in my mind, a hero in the nursing field and also an excellent photographer. So I'm going to set this up to go over to the screen, and we'll be talking a little bit with the PowerPoint presentation on. And basically, Marion McCune Rice, when she went overseas, was probably early 30s. And the reason that they wanted to use somebody in their 30s versus somebody in their early 20s is that they felt that the experience was needed to take care of war injuries, and you needed at least 10 or 15 years of experience to go ahead and work on injured soldiers. And they were right, because it was a very, very tough period for my great aunt and for other nurses, American nurses, French nurses, British nurses. It was psychologically damaging to these nurses. And basically, what I felt was important about Marion McCune Rice's work was that she was the first to serve. She went over to France in 1915. Most American nurses went over to Europe after America got into the war, which was, April of 1917. And they spent about a year over there before they came back at the end of the war. Mary McCune Rice spent almost 4 years over there from 1915 to 1919. So she had roughly 2 years of service before many American nurses went over. She was only one of 255 nurses in the entire country to go over to France to serve. The camera that she used was a Kodak Autographique. And this camera was popular, around 1910 to 1920, 25. And everyone who bought a Kodak wanted to take good pictures ended up buying this camera. It was a pretty darn good lens on it. I've got three of them. This first one here, which I'll show you in a second. If you'll bear with me, we'll get the screen back on. This one here was the first model, and it basically came out in the very early 1910, 1911, 1912-ish, and it was a large camera, and the negative was very large. This camera here, we have a picture of Marion holding a camera, a Kodak Autographic, and this camera was the size that she used. It had about 2¼ by 4¼ inch negatives, and you had roll film. You rolled it through, and then you took the roll out of the camera, and then you sent it to be processed. The next camera that came out, probably a little bit after Marion, was a smaller camera, smaller film, and again, a very good lens. But the more time went by, the smaller the camera and the smaller the film, because technology was improving. So you have this camera here, which was a couple of years after, and you have this camera here, and you can see the difference in the size of the camera here. And the one here that I'm holding took a smaller roll film, and you can see that the bellows went in and out, and you very easily, and this lens was a very good lens. And you use this little resting so that you could take time exposures. You'd rest the camera on the table like this, and you would have taken time exposure, which you'd need back then because the film was kind of slow. And the other cool thing was it was called a Kodak Autographic, and you had a stylus that you could use in the back of the camera. And I'll show you this one here. Here's the stylus right here, right where my index finger is. And you could take this and you could open up a compartment in the back of your camera. And this one, of course, is frozen shut, but you'd open up this right here in the back, and you could write down what you did that day, subject-wise, right on the film itself, and then close this back up, and you could autograph the film. Marion didn't do that because she used photo albums, but you could write on each whatever film, whatever part of the film you wanted by opening this up, and it wouldn't expose the film. So that's why they called it the Kodak Autographic. And it was a big seller back in 1910 to 1920-ish. So that's pretty cool. And the fact that we had one photograph showing her holding that model camera in 1915 documents the accuracy of what we were talking about. So in any case, what we ended up doing was doing the film, as I mentioned, and we documented Olive for 4 years there. And what you see here, I'm going to go to the, try to show the full slide and see what we can do here. And this is a beautiful document that we have in our possession that showed what she needed in order to travel overseas to France. And we have probably, I'd say at least 10 or 15 documents of hers, along with the negatives and the prints that I found. probably almost 800 photographs, probably 300 negatives, all in good condition. And that was roughly from 105, 110 years ago. So I am pretty fortunate to have one of the best collections in America in my possession. Here's a shot of Marion. And Marion is right here. I don't know if you can see the stylus in this presentation, but I'll try to use it. And what they did was they took care of the making a hotel into a hospital. As you can see, these are hotel rooms, lovely decorative paper on the walls. And this was a fun shot. Probably a fellow nurse took the picture using Marion's camera. And these are all fellow nurses. Some of them, for instance, I even know the names of. Marion was friends with several of these nurses throughout her life when she got back from the war. And so that was a big job getting the hospital ready. And again, all of these photos document exactly what took place in France to try to essentially readjust to a national emergency like we're trying to do here with the COVID crisis. Everything changed. No more people in hotels. They were wounded soldiers in hotels. Life changed forever. Marion took some pictures of the surgeries, and look at the lights. The lights up here were horrible. The conditions were horrible. And they were operating essentially in a room that was used for people in the hotel to stay in. They just turned it into an operating room. Not too sterile. Shows the very bad conditions that they were working under. I'm glad the shot is not in color. Here's a shot of an operation going on, and this is obviously before they tried to stitch him up. And a lot of these soldiers, with wounds like this, were stitched up. They healed for maybe a month or two in the hospital. If they were able to walk and hold a gun, they were sent back to the front. Many of them actually killed after they had spent time healing in the hospitals and getting back to the war. It was pretty nasty stuff. You notice these are some French nurses. They wore different outfits than the American nurses. Here's one of the rare shots where somebody actually got a photo of Marion working as a nurse. Obviously, most of the pictures that I have were taken by Marion, so you never saw her at work. This one, I think this is actually the only one that's a good one of her at work. And she's working on one of the patients there. So I cherish this picture. And we still have the uniform that she's wearing here. I still have that here at the house. She kept that too. And so that's another prized possession that I have. The bigger parts of the buildings, the hotels, seminaries, any type of building, were transformed into wards for the soldiers. And essentially just like very transformed McCormick Place in Chicago with beds for the potential COVID crisis. You had a beautiful McCormick Place. Now it's just full of beds. That's the same way it took place in France and other European countries. All of the buildings were transformed into hospitals, and this is one of the cases right here. Here's a postcard. This is not one of Marion's pictures, and it's a postcard that shows the man-made ward. It was obviously another building, and now they have beds and took a picture in the ward here. And again, most of these are French soldiers. This person here, if you can see, this is Abdullah. He was a Muslim. He was injured, and he was in this hospital too. He had a brain injury, as you can see here, and he never quite was the same. He'd run around the hospital ward a little bit out of control. So they had to calm him down a lot. But he was a lovable man, and Marion said a lot about him in her letters. And during the time that she was a nurse, especially in the first hospital she was at, she befriended soldiers. And now, of course, you're supposed to keep professional. You're not supposed to get involved with any soldiers. If you were involved with a soldier, you were essentially fired from the American Red Cross. But you couldn't help but be emotionally attached to some of these soldiers. This soldier here was somebody that Marion really was close to, Exxon Lapeer. And she was extremely fond of him, and she mentioned it in her letters. Of course, you figure what does the word fond mean? They're never going to say anything, but I have a feeling that she really felt very closely to this soldier. And they spent, a lot of time when he was healing in the hospital and recuperating. And this is one of the pictures that Marion took. I add this picture because, as you can see, Marion was very talented with composition. I could show you 30 or 40 other pictures that were outstanding with compositional skills. And this is one of my favorite, which was a nurse picking daffodils in a field beside the hospital. So this is a little short story of my hero nurse, Marion McCune Rice, my great aunt, who happened to be one of the best photographers I've ever known. And I didn't know her for a few years before she passed away. And so I'm very happy to have shared this story with you, one of my own relatives. And we move on to some of the highlights of this particular era. Hey, Kodak is still making headway. They worked on a movie film. This is what Ken Burns used, an Arriflex, but not quite the one in 1922. But Arriflex used Kodak 35 millimeter film in a motion picture film, which was amazing. And so Kodak introduced the 16 millimeter reversal film. Of course, that was famous all the way through to until digital came out, 16 millimeter film, and that's essentially what Ken Burns used with the Arriflex was 16 millimeter film. He didn't use the 35 millimeter film, but then of course Ken Burns did go to the dark side and was shooting a lot of stuff digitally and editing digitally. So everyone at some point goes to the dark side. 1923, we had Harold Egerton inventing the Exxon flash lamp and strobe photography. So way back in 1923, I used strobes today, and they started back then, almost 100 years ago. Just amazing. My units are a little bit smaller than what he's standing next to over there in that picture. So we had some famous photographers and not so famous photographers that did do some key photography over the years. And this was Frank Hurley, and he was an Australian photographer, and he participated in a number of expeditions to Antarctica. He was an explorer and did some great photography during both World Wars. And so I blatantly stole some pictures from Google from him, his work, and this one here is I thought was fantastic, showing the poor penguin essentially frozen. up with ice, and of course they didn't really care about that. They were prepared for it. So he recorded all of the animal life up there too, as well as some of the actual ships that tried to make it up there and probably were frozen in the ice for 6 months. And so took some great stuff there. Back in 1924, there's a gentleman called Ernst Leitz, and of course you all are familiar with the Leica camera, one of the best cameras on the market in 2020, and it was one of the best cameras on the market back in the early 1900s. And Leica is short for, Mr. Lights, so it was Leica, lights, and the camera. And so he shortened Lights camera to Leica. I never knew that until I started researching this stuff. So 35 millimeter was developed, which was revolutionary. At first, his team said, "This is ridiculous. This is not going to fly. It's a stupid idea." And he said, "No, I still want to try it out." So after a couple prototypes, he decided to try them out, and people loved them. It was a hit. And I think the reason they obviously loved them was the fact that so easy to handle, so easy to carry. It was so mobile, and anyone could get into any type of situation without having to have a bulky camera with a tripod. And it really flew both for the professionals and for the consumer market back then. So it was quite a great revolutionary development. This is one of my favorite shots of a photographer, because it basically looks like he's in Siberia, ready to be executed by somebody. But Laszlo Moholy Nagy is a Hungarian gentleman. He was a painter and a photographer. And he was basically somebody who actually pioneered work in painting, drawing, photography, collage, sculpture, film, theater, and writing. Multi-talented person. So he did make an influence in Hungary and around Europe. And basically what he did was sort of cool experimental type pictures, kind of fantasy-like pictures. But so this was not anything close to being a documentarian. It was kind of being a creative use of photography, and thought of some ideas, and he put them onto a photographic paper. So it was really a different form of photography, and very interesting. We had another European, a Russian artist, sculptor, and photographer, even a graphic designer, Alexander Makhanovich Orodchenko, Russian gentleman, and he was again working on all sorts of different types of sort of creative photography. He didn't care if it was angled like this. He just wanted to look for things that were very cool with composition and please the eye. So again, this is used extensively. Started way back then. He was one of in the forefront of not really caring if the camera was on a flat plane. He just was thinking of lines, the use of lines, etc. And of course, everyone does that now. National Geographic, everyone. And so this was started 100 years ago. Hans Bedmer was a German, and he was best known for being a kind of a surrealist photographer. So again, this whole genre of kind of strange photography, which I am famous for strange photography too. And so he would take some of these pictures and go, wow, this guy, I don't know what he's taking, but it's pretty strong medicine. And so this was different, to say the least. But again, it was the type of photography that was very common throughout the last century. Just people coming up with interesting ideas visually and then capturing them on film. 1934, moving into the 30s, the 35 millimeter cartridge was introduced, making 35 millimeter film easy to use. So basically, you know, you do your thing, shoot the pictures and send it to a lab and get your pictures back. Everything was getting to be much more consumer oriented, and you wouldn't have to send it necessarily to Boston or New York. You started to have local labs where you could just take your pictures, get them processed. My folks were taking a lot of pictures back in the 30s, and I have a lot of those negatives. And again, I don't know what camera they used, but it was typical 35 millimeter film that you see today. It came in a roll of 36, and it was developed, and the prints were made from it, or a contact sheet. So back in the 1930s, everything really didn't change much until digital, as far as taking the pictures in the camera, taking the cartridge, having it developed, and getting prints back. And so we've had that roughly for 80 or 90 years now. Nothing has changed that much until digital came out. Man Ray is another man who probably was a legend in his own mind, because anyone who comes up with something that's not his real name tends to think a lot of themselves. This was Emanuel Radnitsky. And basically, he was an American visual artist, and but he did spend a lot of time in Paris. And he was kind of a far-out gentleman who, again, took pictures of very interesting objects in more of an artistic form, and certainly not a documentary form. So these are a couple samples of what he did with his work. And again, pictures were being seen as works of art, and were certainly a part of the whole culture back then. People started buying photographs as well as paintings, and putting them in their houses, and they were seeing it as very creative art, which is, we are all artists. August Sander, again, we really think of him as a portrait and documentary photographer, and so he was known for mostly his German portraits, and he came out with just recording different people in their garb that kind of indicated what they were all about. And again, it was very simple backgrounds, good lighting, typical portraiture situation. He did get out of the studio and again recorded life outside the studio, but again, it was more, these are individual people, they're looking right at the camera. He's recording what they're about, and having them, wear their outfits that they wear every day in their work. Again, we have probably businessmen, and a nice formal portrait, but again, all looking at the camera, all posing, and being recorded that way. We have Andrei Curtis, and he is a Hungarian-born photographer, and I think he was well known for really taking composition to another degree. And also, he's known for the photo essay, which again was a big part of photojournalism. So this is why I like this guy, because we took pictures in our newspaper business, and they were features, sports, environmental portraits. But when we had time and we had a big subject, we put together photos in a group, and we call them photo essays. And they would be an essay on a certain important part of life in this region. And unfortunately, the photographic essays are fewer and fewer now because the newspapers have less room in the paper due to less advertising. And they don't put the photo essays in because they take at least a page, maybe 2 pages. And the owners look at that and say, that's $500 or $1,000 that I don't have. Why should I give you, Steve Hooper, a photo page? But I did a lot of those back in the 90s, early 2000s, and loved doing them. Photo essay was one of my favorite things to do in photojournalism. So he would cover many things out there. Just a couple samples of what he did with everyday photojournalism. Again, he didn't care if the camera was on a flat plane, the horizon was on a flat plane. He just felt he wanted to do compositions. You know, look at the nice vertical use of lines here with the shadows. If you try to do something with a flat plane, you would have just gotten a flat shadow. So this is beautiful composition. And when I tried doing this at the Keene Sentinel, they wanted to put me in alcoholics group to try to sober up. So I didn't do too much of that. They felt it was just a little bit wacko. But occasionally we tried to sneak in something that where the horizon wasn't quite flat. And we liked it, even though the editors thought that basically we were drinking heavily. I have Imogene Cunningham. Again, she was extremely gifted, and she was a member of the very famous group called Group F64 in California. And 2 people were in that. Weston, Ansel Adams was in that group, and it was an exclusive group. And so she really, really was one of the more famous American photographers back in the 1930s, 1940s, along with Ansel Adams. And you can see by just her sensitivity to her pictures that she really was gifted in not only composition, but quality of her pictures, and just her feeling of setting pictures up in a way that really moved people. And again, Ansel Adams of this group was more like landscapes, whereas Imogene Cunningham tended to be more of a close-up photographer, using different parts to experiment with showing some type of feeling in a picture with close-ups. Weston, a member of the group, actually was sort of in between. He took a lot of close-ups of nature, you know, designs of patterns on stumps, on dead wood. He saw patterns in nature and took close-ups of those patterns. Whereas another one of my heroes, besides Marion McCune Rice, was Ansel Adams, and did get to meet him. As I mentioned before, it was exciting to talk to him briefly when he was on a book tour in Chicago. So look at him. Back then, he was using not a 35 millimeter, but a medium format camera. He also used huge cameras that were 5x7 format. If you look at his images, there was no grain in them, no grain from the silver emulsion, because he used large format negatives. He was able to get pictures that just looked like there was absolutely no grain in them whatsoever, because he concentrated with medium and large format negatives. And as you can see, you know, he was pretty young in this picture. This is probably in the 30s. And when I met him, it was the late 70s. He was actually in his late 70s at that time. But he again was interested in the more of a landscape type of shot, and catching nature in black and white. And I'll tell you what, there's no one that did it better. He could move people emotionally with his black and white pictures. You did not need color whatsoever with anything that he did. Composition, of course, he had major compositional skills, and rule of thirds here with the picture of the sun on this one tree with a beautiful background of other trees. He used the zone system, which basically had to do with how you develop the negative based on how you expose the negative. And so in many cases, what he would do is he expose for the shadows and develop for the highlights. He would expose for the dark areas and develop for the highlights. And when you expose for the shadows and develop for the highlights, you're able to get a dynamic range from roughly 1 to 9, which is from black almost to almost white. So he was a genius when it came to getting the most out of the silver in the emulsion, so that he could get black blacks and he could get white whites, and do this all with the skill of his developing techniques. And that he called the zone system. I've got several of his books still on the zone system. And when we did black and white at the Sentinel, I used his zone system for my black and white work at the Sentinel. When we went color, I didn't use the zone system, but it is amazing what happens when you have a different technique of developing black and white film and then printing it. Also, he did a lot of dodging and burning his prints. And in the early days, he would do all of his own prints that he would sell. But in later days, he developed arthritis and was a little bit tough. So he had his assistants that he could afford at that point in the darkroom, and the assistants would make all of his prints. He would sign them, of course. So he had a big operation in his later years in his life, but he made a pretty good income. I sure wish I had some of his original prints at this point. It's one of my favorite prints here that, of course, is famous, and it basically has the beautiful compositional S curve here, and again, composition with the lines, both diagonal and horizontal, are absolutely fantastic. So what I wanted to do here was to kind of bookend the show with both two of my heroes. Start the show with Miriam McEwen Rice, and then the presentation with Ansel Adams. So what you've seen in the 1915 to 1939 range was, again, a continuation of technology, advancement in film, advancement in the making the cameras smaller and smaller, easier for the consumer to use, easier to take the film to the lab and have it processed. And you also saw the continuation of the various genres of photography, where more and more people around the world were becoming photojournalists, and they continue to be portrait photographers, documentation photographers, fashion photographers, artist photographers, so to speak, that I just did kind of wild, surreal type of things. So it opened up the whole area of spreading photography more easily around the world. And then once you got into about 1940 on, that continued. We had more and more magazines develop. We'll talk about that. You had magazine photographers starting all over the place. You had war photographers, World War II, where you were able to take the cameras into the action and get just horrific shots that way. And you had basically the newspaper photographers that were able to not have too bulky stuff and able to get pictures that way. And also use the strobes to get shots that they needed for the newspapers when it was nighttime. And it continued to develop. from a technical standpoint there. So looking forward to talking next week, week 5, about that. So until then, we're going to sign off now. And thank you so much for listening. I'll get the MP4 for you and get it out very soon this weekend. Okay, bye everybody. Take care. See ya.
Anybody else?